Animal form and function and homeostasis. Be able to define tissues, organs, organ systems, endocrine system, nervous system, endocrine glands, negative feedback, positive feedback, pancreas, pituitary gland, regulator, conformer, homeostasis, thermoregulation, and countercurrent exchange. Be able to identify different types of tissues and give examples. Identify the roles of the endocrine and the nervous systems. Compare animal and plant hormones, that's a different lecture, and relate negative feedback to homeostasis. How are animals organized? Well, we've covered in Bio141 how atoms are organized into molecules and how molecules are organized into cells. In Bio142, we're going to take a look into how tissues are put into organs and how organs are put into organisms. We've already looked at populations with Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. The organ systems are formed according to their function. You don't have to memorize all of these. We're actually going to look at some of these in different organisms and compare them between different organisms to see how adaptations help organisms survive in their various environments. Cells are organized into tissues. They attach to a basement membrane to organize into layers, or they have certain polarity with one direction facing inside or one direction facing outside. Cells attach to one another to form a tissue. We looked at this earlier a bit when we talked about multicellular organisms, but we're going to see how cell division and cell attachments are going to govern the form of these tissues. First off, epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue borders the inside of the body and the outside of the body. Everything you see on the outside of a body is epithelial tissue, and that includes the intestine. If you were to swallow a camera, you would see epithelial tissue because that would technically be the outside of the body. Epithelial tissues have cells in layers, and these layers are often slewing off and being released into the environment. There are rapid rates of cell division in epithelial tissues, and epithelial tissues have what are known as apical and basal surfaces. That's a distinct polarity where the apical surface is on the outside and the basal surface is on the inside of the organism. Nervous tissue is specialized to conduct electrical signals. These cells have a charge and can depolarize rapidly in what is called an action potential. Synapses between cells are allowing for intercellular communication by the release of neurotransmitters and the reception of neurotransmitters. We can look distinctly at neurons and glial cells when looking at nervous tissue. Glial cells support neurons. Muscle tissue contracts and causes movement. Muscle tissues have multiple nuclei, many mitochondria, and the cytoskeleton may be organized in striations. You can see these stripes here in the skeletal muscle. And there are three types of muscle tissue. The skeletal muscle with striations is attached to bones. The cardiac muscle has gap junctions between the cells, allowing them to share a charge, and is found in the heart. And the smooth muscle is around tubes, such as the tubes in the arteries and in the intestines. Connective tissue serves a variety of functions. And connective tissue is basically cells floating in an extracellular matrix or secured in an extracellular matrix such as in bones. The cells actually secrete this ECM, extracellular matrix, so you have bones, blood, and the basement membrane of epithelium are all different types of connective tissue. Now, we're going to look at how cells communicate with one another in the endocrine or nervous system, because there are two different ways that animals use cells to communicate with one another. The nervous system uses electrical charges and can signal to a very single cell. So a nervous system can transmit a signal to just one muscle cell, allowing that muscle cell to contract. And these are short-term responses, like moving your leg. The endocrine system is going to use hormones. Now, that's going to signal throughout the bloodstream, and technically it signals to all cells, but is only received with cells that have the right receptors. These are for longer-term responses, like your body telling you to grow hair in new places. That's a very endocrine kind of thing. Endocrine glands are those which produce the hormones. We have the thyroid gland, the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, including both posterior and anterior pituitary, the pancreas that releases insulin and glucagon and monitors sugar levels in the blood, the testes and ovaries in males and females, the adrenal glands, and the parathyroid glands. All of these are endocrine glands, and all of these are producing hormones. That's a definition of an endocrine gland, is a gland that produces hormones. A simple pathway of the endocrine system will look like this. There is a stimulus that goes on. That can be a lot of different things, like low pH in the duodenum. Cells that receive this stimulus will then release certain hormones. And this example would be secretin, which is circulated in the blood and then is received by pancreatic cells, causing the response of a bicarbonate release. This is just how a simple endocrine pathway would work. The same hormone can cause different responses. Consider when epinephrine is received by a liver cell or by the smooth muscle cell in the wall of a blood vessel that supplies skeletal muscles. In both cases, epinephrine is received by a beta receptor. In the liver cell, glycogen is metabolized to glucose, which is released into the bloodstream to increase glucose levels in the bloodstream. The smooth muscle cell in the wall of the blood vessel that supplies skeletal muscle doesn't have glycogen deposits. What it does is actually going to dilate the blood vessel, increasing the flow of blood to the skeletal muscle, thus giving the skeletal muscle more blood, which now includes more glucose. The smooth muscle cell in the intestines, however, if it were to increase the blood flow to the intestines, that's not going to help the epinephrine response, which is fight or flight. What it does is actually contract and decreases the flow of blood to the intestines. This is the fight or flight response being received by different cells with different receptors with different responses. And this is what allows a hormone to go to all the different cells of the body, only be received by some, and be received in different ways. Homeostasis is the maintenance of a stable interior condition despite changing exterior conditions. To maintain that, you have to have feedback within the system, mainly negative feedback. So negative feedback maintains homeostasis by changing things away from the direction that they're currently going. Insulin, for example, is going to decrease the amount of glucose in the blood when the blood glucose gets too high. Glucagon increases the amount of blood glucose when the blood glucose levels get too low. Calcitonin and parathyroid hormone are going to increase or decrease the calcium levels in the blood. This is negative feedback and is needed for homeostasis. Positive feedback is something else, and we're not going to look a lot at that. That is going to be movement from something to a new equilibrium. For example, oxytocin is going to cause the uterus to contract, causing the baby to push against the cervix, which causes an increase in the amount of oxytocin, which causes the uterus to contract more, causing the baby to push more, causing more oxytocin. This positive feedback loop is going to end with childbirth. It's not going to maintain homeostasis. It's going to change things. Negative feedback is what is going to be maintaining homeostasis. And regulators are going to change their internal environment in response to any external changes. Look at this otter. It is going to maintain its temperature through homeostasis. Conformers actually just allow their internal environment to match their external environment. And one way they can actually change their internal environment is actually just by moving to a different external environment. This is how lizards can actually have fevers. They move to a different external environment. But it should be pointed out that they are still conforming to their internal environment to their external environment by changing their external environment. And I've already defined homeostasis here. The river otter here is maintaining temperature homeostasis. It is a temperature regulator. Thermal regulation works in the following way. Homeostasis will use that negative feedback. You have a set point, say the room temperature, and a stimulus, let's say the room temperature decreases. The sensor, in that case a part of the thermostat, is going to detect that the room temperature has decreased. It is then going to use this information to send to the control center, a different part of the thermostat, that there is a change that is away from the set point. The response will be turning a heater on, and that is going to increase the room temperature, thus bringing it back to the set point. Remember, homeostasis moves things back to set point when they are moving away from set point. We see this in the body. You have a normal body temperature of about 38 to 36 degrees Celsius. If that decreases, then the sensors in the skin are going to detect that. They're going to send a signal to the thermostat in the hypothalamus, which is your control center, and that's going to activate warming mechanisms in the body, like shivering or constricting vessels in the skin, causing an increase in the body temperature, which brings it back to the normal body temperature. In this case, the temperature has changed back to normal when it started moving away. This is negative feedback. A bit of anatomy we're going to see a couple different times is this counter current exchange. And your book covers that right next to negative feedback. This is not homeostasis. This is just how some of this stuff works. It's kind of cool. We're going to see it in both kidneys and fish gills. The countercurrent exchange moves an artery and a vein next to one another so that you have the exchange of heat going down. You see how that exchange of heat is always from higher to lower, but this allows the artery to cool the blood as it moves towards the foot and warm the blood when it moves from the foot. So we're going to see this in fish gills and kidneys later on. It's a good time to introduce that. It minimizes heat loss in these organisms, and later we're going to see how it works with oxygen and water loss.